Presentation is on part 2 of Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library by Wayne Wiegand, and I will be discussing chapters 6 through 10. These themes that Wiegand addresses in part 2 are issues of access, censorship, patron needs, and technology. Chapter 6 opens with the Great Depression and concludes with World War II. Wiegand notes that libraries saw their own struggles in the early 30s, especially with budget cuts. Library appeals for book donations helped to supplement the imposed budgetary restrictions. Another issue during this time was access to libraries, especially for those living in more rural areas of the United States. Bookmobiles helped to solve many of these problems, but in the heartland, libraries found an alternative method of book delivery. Wiegand states, Kentucky used Federal Emergency Relief Administration funds to hire 4 young women to deliver public library books by horseback to 57 mountain schools and communities in Leslie County, a place so rural it had few roads connecting them. To get books to residents, librarians rode their horses along riverbeds. Within 4 years, 100 federally funded pack horse librarians were delivering books to rural Kentuckians, on page 138. Even in spite of economic downturn, collection size, circulation, and borrowers had all increased in public libraries. In 1939, the ALA adopted the Library Bill of Rights. And while it was not perfect, it helped provide a framework for working around issues of censorship. Wiegand states on page 147, it posited that libraries had a responsibility to fight censorship and thus embrace, at least in abstract democratic rhetoric, the defense of intellectual freedom as a professional imperative. These issues were not only outside of libraries, but librarians themselves, who at this time favored classic literature as opposed to the popular fiction of the day, going so far as not stocking those titles. Wiegand concludes this chapter by stating, by 1945, 2 generations of Americans had experienced a Main Street Carnegie Building as a public place where the community displayed its cultural values, where people gathered to connect and exchange pleasantries and points of view, and where appropriate social behaviors were modeled and learned. 7 begins with an update to the Library Bill of Rights at the 1948 ALA conference. Wiegand states on page 165, at the conference, the ALA also revised Principle 3 of the Library Bill of Rights to read, censorship of books urged or practiced by volunteer arbiters of morals or political opinion, or by organizations that would establish a coercive concept of Americanism, must be challenged by libraries in maintenance of their responsibility to provide public information and enlightenment through the printed word. Wiegand mentions several issues of censorship, from librarians not stocking particular texts to outside groups and individuals calling for the removal of texts from the library. Groups like the National Organization for Decent Literature publish lists of inappropriate texts for religious and moral reasons. Data shows that libraries in the heartland did not stock the titles that appeared on the NODL lists, proving that this type of censorship was indeed effective. Wiegand states on page 168, but largely out of sight, another kind of subtle influence operated, one that not only complicates the simplistic, quote, not censorship but selection, unquote, phrase introduced into the library's lexicon at mid-century, but also shows how public libraries function in negotiating a community's acceptable literary boundaries. Another major issue during this time period was segregation in libraries, especially in the American South. According to Wiegand, although censorship actively engaged many public librarians after World War II, an analysis of efforts to integrate Jim Crow public libraries in the American South between 1946 and 1964 shows librarians across the country were mostly silent and largely absent, on page 172. He goes on to say, desegregation of public libraries was always painful. It was not always violent or immediately successful. White Southerners who defended Black access to public libraries paid a price, on page 173. 8 focuses on library funding and expansion from 1964 to 1980. During Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, the U.S. saw an increase to library funding under the Library Services and Construction Act. Libraries became more focused on meeting the needs of their users. Book selection, bookmobiles, and programming all reflect these changes. During this time, more school libraries opened, so bookmobiles focused on serving more traditionally underserved communities, and more programs were designed with patrons in mind, from education to art. There was also more attention given to children's literature. Positive changes include librarians seeking out texts that included girls and peoples of color in constructive and positive ways. According to Wiegand on page 215, like the Library Bill of Rights in the ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom, the Council on Interracial Books for Children, formed as a nonprofit in 1965 to identify non-racist, non-sexist literature in its 8 times per year bulletin, became yet another external player in librarians' local discussions about best reading. Unfortunately, negative changes included librarians targeting books with, quote, questionable content, especially concerned with LGBT issues. 9 focuses on issues of technology and access from 1981 to 2000. During this time, more libraries were becoming automated with the advent of online public access catalogs. Librarians also focused on providing more varied media for patrons. According to Wiegand, as the entertainment and information industries introduced new forms of communication, the American Public Library responded. In 1990, libraries offered not only books and periodicals, films and recordings, but videocassettes, compact discs, audiobooks, and sometimes even the playback equipment readers needed to access the stories these texts contained, now in more languages to match the increasingly diverse populations they served, on page 222. Although several years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, issues of access to storefront libraries served people of color more often than libraries in affluent white areas. Wiegand states, when the nation experienced a recession in the early 1990s, the budget cuts it forced threatened libraries on poor Black more than affluent white neighborhoods. For example, in 1991, the Omaha Public Library System decided to close a Black neighborhood branch because the number of books circulated there was the lowest of the system's 10 branches. However, in San Diego, or reservation inhabitants. Because the librarians also lived on a reservation, patrons felt more welcome. Wiegand goes on to say, they told librarians they especially noticed a difference the library had made in the lives of their children, who did better in school. Librarians also screened children's books for stereotypes. We're not animals, and we're not furniture or inanimate objects, said the librarian. Very quickly, reservation libraries became community centers where people felt free to chat, drink coffee, and speak in normal tones, on page 233. That examines libraries from 2001 to the present, and Wiegand notes changes in how technology actually impacted libraries in opposition to the expected impact it was to have. He states, the computers that 30 years earlier many predicted would cause the demise of the public library have actually made it more accessible. To librarians behind the circulation desk, it certainly feels like computers touch everything in library practice, but public library traditions also endure. Wiegand also addresses those who question the necessity of public libraries by stating, many authorities still have questions about the value of public libraries. Most questions emanate from convictions trapped in blinded thinking about what a public library does for its community. Wiegand focused not only on the positives of public libraries and library culture in America, but on negatives as well. It is important for future librarians to understand that library culture was not immune to issues of the time, but it is our responsibility to our patrons that is the most important part of the library experience.